Let's talk about this sweetheart of a little car that was Oldsmobile's last new model that it introduced, as well as its last car produced, and that is the Oldsmobile Alero. And what you're seeing here is a 2004 Oldsmobile Alero, the final model year of the Alero, and this particular car has under 300 miles on it, so it's basically a brand new 2004 automobile. Not quite sure how that survived or why anybody would preserve this particular vehicle, but I have to say I think that it is cool. Now, the Alero was introduced in late 1998 as a 1999 model year car, and as I mentioned, that means that it ran from 1999 through 2004. And this was a car that was off of the General Motors N-body platform, the N-body platform that started in 1985. And in 1985, its inaugural year, there was the Pontiac Grand Am, the Olds Calais, as well as the Buick Somerset that formed the basis for the N-car platform. By this point, there was the Olds Alero, the Pontiac Grand Am, and then the Chevrolet Malibu, which was introduced for the 1997 model year, was also part of this, what was now called the GMX 130 platform program. GM had kind of gone away from the letter names on its platforms. And there was also the Oldsmobile Cutlass, a kind of warmed-over Malibu that was off of this platform. The Buick Skylark had been dropped by this point, unfortunately, I guess because nobody wanted a bird beak variant of this particular car. So that's a little bit of background on the Alero and its platform, but we'll talk about a few more features, including the design now. So the first thing to note about the Alero is that the front end obviously bears more than a passing resemblance to the 1995 Oldsmobile Aurora. And that 1995 Aurora was really a seminal car and was meant to set a new design direction for Oldsmobile. In fact, the car doesn't say Oldsmobile anywhere on it except on the radio. And in fact, Oldsmobile, when it was creating various prototypes of the car, did have Oldsmobile rocket badging on the front and on the wheel centers, but that was taken off when the car was productionized. And I think it was just because, remember at this time, Oldsmobile, or a little bit before that 95 Aurora, Oldsmobile had the new generation of Olds slogan, and before that, the not your father's Oldsmobile. So they were trying to take Oldsmobile in a completely new direction. And the 95 Aurora really did set that and was successful from a styling exercise standpoint. Unfortunately, I don't know that you could call the car a complete success. And it really was an okay seller. It wasn't a great seller in any years. And, you know, it's interesting that as a result of that, Oldsmobile decided to proliferate the styling across the entire lineup. There was, of course, the Aurora, which there was also the second generation Aurora that came after the 1999 model year, which was the last year of the first generation car. Interestingly, in between the transition in the first and second generation Aurora, there was no 2000 model year car. There was just the 1999, which was the last year of the first generation, and then the 2001 was the first year of the second generation, which would run through the 2003 model year before it was sunset. So Oldsmobile copied that styling from the Aurora onto the Intrigue and then kind of onto the Alero. And I have to say, I think the look works on the Alero. It's a bit less, let's say, in your face than the Intrigue and the Aurora, but I think it's still a handsome car nonetheless. And it's unfortunate. The Alero actually was something that spawned out of the Oldsmobile Alero show car, which was this beautiful, greeny, goldy coupe that Oldsmobile had introduced just a few years prior to the Alero's introduction. More specifically, that Oldsmobile Alero Alpha show car, as it was known, debuted for the 1997 model year. And it had, let's say, more sculpture to the body side as well as the rear area than the production variants. But of course, the production variant had to share a number of components with the other N-body vehicles, including the windshield, the side glass, the A-pillars, and other componentry. So the production Alero just didn't look quite as dramatic. Now, one thing I will point out is notice the mirrors on the Alero. An interesting little tidbit was that Pontiac ended up using those Alero mirrors on its Grand Am beginning in, I believe, the 2002 model year. So the Pontiac Grand Am, when it was introduced as a restyled vehicle, came out in 1999. So 1999, 2000, 2001 have a unique mirror to Pontiac. But the Alero mirror was used from 2002 onward, really not as a cost savings, but because it was found that some people were complaining of wind noise in the Grand Ams, and the way that the mirror was designed, it was actually creating turbulent airflow just outside of the door side glass and creating a bit of wind rush. So Pontiac went with the Alero mirror, which I don't think necessarily goes with the car. It looks a little bit like Dumbo ears on it, as opposed to the more stylized mirror that Pontiac used, but it did allegedly reduce wind noise. And how do I know that? Well, I was working for General Motors at the time, so that was something that I worked on back in the day. Now, as we transition along to this rear view of the Alero, notice again it has some similar design, particularly the tail lamps from the Alero Alpha concept, but the car is unfortunately more conventionally styled. And it looks like some of the Pontiac designers got a hold of the Alero from some angles because it has those ribs in the fascia. And that was something that the 97 Grand Prix had. That was because John Manoogian was forced to add those ribs to that particular Pontiac. And he didn't want to do it on the body sides. He just did it on the fascia. Of course, the Grand Am of this era had the guardrail styling, I guess I'll call it. Pontiac had ribs ever since the 1985 Grand Am was introduced. But the ribs on the 85 Grand Am were kind of inset. And then they went with the 1999 Grand Am, they sat proud of the rest of the body. So they kind of inverted the rib design. And those ribs would go away shortly thereafter the introduction of the Grand Am. They would be around in 1999, 2000, 2001 before being toned down. And one last look of the rear three-quarter view of this Alero before we rotate on into the interior. I have to say that I do like the six-spoke wheels. Notice that they are six-spoke wheels. They're not five-spoke wheels because Chevrolet had to have five-spoke wheels. During this time, GM was into the so-called brand character, and each brand had a number of elements that were character cues. And, well, for Chevrolet, it was five-spoke, so the other divisions had to do something different. I do think they look handsome here. And I actually remember that each of the design studios at GM this time, when you walked in them, had a bunch of brand character items, like Buick would have a set of golf clubs, things that were on display as you entered the studio before you walked in. And I actually was an intern at GM Design and at GM during the period in which they were dismantling Oldsmobile Studios, sadly. So I got to watch that, at least for a brief bit. And I don't recall what Oldsmobile had in their little brand character area. If somebody worked at GM Design, put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Now, as we transition to the interior, we'll notice a couple things about this. One thing was that Oldsmobile, on the Intrigue as well as the Alero, was really trying to rotate hard into emulating the Japanese. And you consequently see these kind of two-tone, neutral-themed interiors, where Oldsmobile did spend a fair amount of money on quite a bit of soft-touch materials. You notice that IP is soft-touch, the area around the glove box is soft-touch. And yet, despite the fact that they indeed spent a lot of money on the interior, it still looks a little bit cheap. The fitments and all the different things just don't look quite right compared to a Japanese car. Take a look as an example at that bezel that surrounds the radio and HVAC controls. That's a hard plastic piece. And GM during this time was radiusing everything so that it didn't show if it didn't mate up perfectly. So you notice these little radii around every single little piece of interior trim so that the eye didn't catch that it was perhaps not lining up. Not necessarily my favorite. Even look at the airbag and the line that surrounds it, the cutout for the door. You'll notice that both surfaces there are radius as opposed to just being flush. And again, that was GM execution in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. Kind of unfortunate. Well, it is what it is. Also notice on the center console, this car has the optional ashtray, which was removable. It just was a little cup that sat in the cup holder, and you could take it out. And I think they actually had a smoker's package on these that you could order. Otherwise, you didn't get the ashtray. GM was still using corporate radios during this time frame, and you have a basic Delco radio here. And of course, this car has a 5-speed manual transmission, super, super rare for an Alero. So somebody wanted a little bit of sporting flair, or they just didn't want to pay money for the automatic. You'll notice it also has crank windows, so I have a feeling that this is just a lower spec car, and somebody wanted a little bit of value and didn't mind the manual transmission. Now, one thing I always found interesting about the Oldsmobile Alero and Intrigue interiors was that they really departed so significantly from that original 1995 to 1999 Aurora interior. And while that Aurora interior somehow made a very, very large car feel very small on the inside because it has this enormous center console that takes up a ton of space, it looked cool. And if you drove an Aurora, you actually felt like you were in a driver's-centric car, and it was kind of like an airplane cockpit. It felt cool, and the car had a lot of unique switchgear as well. But for the Alero and the Intrigue, they rotated harder into this, emulating the Japanese style of interior. One thing I really didn't like, you should always have a good door handle when you open the door, because that's something that the customer uses all the time. And unfortunately on these, you can see the door handle is just a piece of cheap plastic, and it doesn't feel substantial. It kind of feels like it's going to break every time you use it. So that just didn't lend an air of quality to the interior either. At least the seating comfort was halfway decent. The cloth in these wasn't overly expensive, and you can see some interior trim pieces. That rear C-pillar trim on the inside was just hard plastic and pretty awful. And take a look, GM didn't even put the effort forth to, let's say, contain or hide the wiring for the rear window defroster. You can see it there on the C-pillar trim, the leads for the wires, but, well, again, this was GM during this particular time frame. The seats, like I said, were decent. Unfortunately, the center console had this hard plastic top, and that's a big pet peeve of mine, and I don't know why even in economy cars sometimes today, they still just can't put a little bit of padding on that center console or on the door armrest. It just makes it so much more comfortable on longer trips. But, well, it is what it is. Now, under hood, this particular Alero has the standard Ecotec 2.2 or L850 four-cylinder engine, double overhead cam engine that made 140 horsepower. Not a huge amount of horsepower, but I will say that, interestingly, if you have an Alero with this engine, you have a Lotus engine under hood. Lotus actually did a fair amount of the engineering on this engine, along with GM's Opel subsidiary. So it's actually a pretty decent engine. Some people have a few issues, like timing chain issues with these, but I've had them and have had really good luck with them. They're, I won't say overly powerful, but they're pretty smooth. The one thing that they do lack, I notice, is mid-range punch, particularly from, let's say 2,500 to 3,500, 4,000 RPM. They're a little bit gutless there. They have good low-end torque below that and relatively good horsepower above that, but that mid-range is a little soft on these. But that said, they're pretty good and reliable engines overall. Optional was a 3.4-liter pushrod overhead valve V6. That 3.4-liter V6 was derived from the 2.8-liter V6 that was introduced in GM's X cars in 1980. It was an engine that went from 2.8 liters to 3.1 liters to 3.4 liters in cars like this Alero. And then from there, it actually got enlarged into the 3.5 and 3.9 liter high-value V6 engines that would make their way into various GM vehicles in the 2000s, like the Pontiac G6 as an example. But the 3400, again, I would say was an okay engine, not my favorite, well known for intake gasket leaks, which is not a horrible repair, but they all had leaking intake gaskets, all of them, unfortunately. And, that engine is a little bit coarse. Again, I would say it's not my favorite. It's not a rever, but it did give you a little bit more power than the four-cylinder that you see under hood in this particular Alero. So what do you think of this Alero? This one, again, has only 300 miles on it, a little less than 300 miles. And I kind of almost want to buy it as a curiosity because I like the way that they look, and it's the last Oldsmobile. And, Oldsmobile was pretty cool. I have a number of Oldsmobiles in my collection, but of course I like the ones with the Oldsmobile engines in them, the rocket V8s that they used back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, well, starting in 1949, actually. And then by the time you got to the 80s, well, the Oldsmobile V8s were pretty much gone. The Olds 307 would last into the early 90s, and that was the last true Oldsmobile V8, but it was found under hood in many different vehicles, including Cadillacs like the Fleetwood Brougham. So put a comment in the comment section as to what you think about this Alero. Thanks again for watching.